They paid $7,000 for her. And by the end of it, men would be dead, fortunes would tremble, and a city built on secrets would learn that the most dangerous thing in New Orleans was not a weapon, not a scandal, but a woman who knew who she was. The night it began, the St. Louis Hotel blazed with candlelight and greed, the air thick with cigar smoke and perfume, and the restless hum of wealthy men pretending they were not about to witness something extraordinary outside the Mississippi rolled dark and silent, but inside the largest slave market in America. The river of money was about to surge. She stood on the platform as lot number 17, yet no one saw a number. They saw a skin described as cream touched with coffee eyes, like amber catching fire in the light, long black hair cascading down her back, and a stillness that did not belong to someone about to be sold. There was no trembling, no visible fear, only a composure that unsettled the room. The auctioneer, Thomas Williams, cleared his throat and began the bidding at a price already absurd, 5 times the value of a skilled house servant. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some laughed nervously, others leaned forward as if proximity alone could secure ownership, and then the numbers began to climb. 800, 1,000, 1,500. Each bid struck like a drumbeat in the corner. A northern businessman named James Thornton watched with growing unease. Later he would write in his diary that he had never seen such frenzy among gentlemen of standing, that the bidding carried something almost religious, as though they believed acquiring her would grant them absolution or power beyond property. 2,000, 3,045. Room grew fevered. She did not lower her eyes. That was the first thing many remembered. Later she looked at them, not pleading, not defiant, simply away. The sum reached $7,000. A gasp moved through the hall, because that amount could purchase land workers' entire futures. Yet Charles Delacroix did not hesitate. He raised his hand with the calm of a man accustomed to command, and the gavel fell. Sold. But the sale was not ordinary. The notary William Patterson recorded something peculiar in his ledger at the insistence. The bill of sale would not describe her as slave, but as ward to be housed in his Royal Street residence. A technicality perhaps, or perhaps something more strategic. Her name was Elellanena Reynolds, though few in that room cared to remember it. To them she was the Pearl, a nickname already spreading through the French Quarter, like a rumor that refused to die. Weeks earlier she had arrived in New Orleans aboard a vessel called the Augusta, listed not as cargo but as passenger, accompanying a merchant named Marcus Bennett. By the time the ship docked, Bennett was dead, claimed by fever contracted in Havana, and with no free papers found among his possessions. Elellanena had been seized by authorities and funneled into the machinery of the market. Public record called it unfortunate. Whispers suggested design, because women of her refinement did not simply drift into bondage. She spoke with education, carried herself like someone accustomed to libraries, not fields. And when asked simple questions, she answered with measured clarity that betrayed schooling, rare even among free citizens. No one in that hotel exchange understood that night was that her presence threatened more than social order. It threatened inheritance. New Orleans, in 1837, was a city of layered identities: French, Spanish, American, African, free, enslaved, a place where bloodlines dictated destiny, and a single ancestor could tip the balance between privilege and chains. Fortunes rose on sugar and cotton, and human bodies were tallied like inventory. Yet beneath that rigid hierarchy lay a fragile truth. Documentation mattered, proof mattered, and somewhere in Elellannena's past there existed both. As Delacroix escorted her from the hotel, carriage wheels clattering over cobblestone, onlookers strained for a better view. Some swore. She glanced back at the building, not in despair but in calculation, as if memorizing the place for reasons not yet revealed. That the Royal Street mansion. She was given a private chamber, not servant quarters. Gowns befitting a society lady, not plantation garb. Visitors were told she was a distant cousin from France. Isabelle Delacroix departed 4 notches within weeks, taking the children and leaving her husband alone with his ward, and rumors thickened like summer humidia. Why hide her? Why pay so much? Why insist on language that blurred ownership? Answers flickered just beyond reach. Months later, Dr. Samuel Lawrence would be summoned to attend her persistent cough in his journal. He noted not only symptoms of consumption but distress of spirit, and when she attempted to speak of her true circumstances, Delacroix re-entered the room and silence sealed itself between them. Meanwhile, across the city, another family watched closely. The Villars lineage, old, powerful, secretive, its patriarch, Henry Villars, had been among the most aggressive bidders that night before Delacroix secured the prize. And that detail did not go unnoticed, because there had long been rumors of an estranged son, Jean-Baptiste, who had traveled north years earlier and formed a relationship with a free woman of color in Philadelphia. Whispers of a marriage unrecognized, of a child born months after his death at sea, and if that child had survived, if proof of legitimacy existed under Louisiana law, the consequences would be seismic, would fracture her reputation, would shatter wealth, would shift hand. The system that reduced her to property would be forced to acknowledge her as heir inside the mansion. Elellanena began writing her journal. Careful, precise entries, at first mundane. Weather books, meals, yet beneath the surface tension gathered. She was forbidden to leave the inner courtyard. Told her papers were being processed. Promised freedom delayed. Again and again she listened, she observed, she pieced together fragments. A visitor named Villars studied her features with unsettling intensity, speaking in French about resemblance and bloodline, believing she could not understand, but she did, and slowly realization dawned her. Captivity was not about labor or desert, was containment. She was being kept not because she was valuable as a slave, but because she was dangerous as a daughter. By summer, escape took root in her thoughts. By autumn, plans formed by winter alliances emerged beyond plantation walls. Abolitionists moved in shadows. Rumors of inheritance, disputes brewed in drawing rooms, and the pearl once sold under candlelight began to understand that the stage upon which she had been displayed was far larger than an auction block. The men who bid that night believed they were purchasing, but he had unknowingly purchased a reckoning. And as the city of New Orleans drifted deeper into its contradictions, unaware of the storm gathering beneath silk gowns and legal documents, Elellanena Reynolds waited, watched, and prepared. The most perilous transformation in any society is not when the enslaved beg for mercy, it is when they discover they were never meant to be enslaved at all. The moment Elellanena Reynolds understood that her captivity was not an accident, but a strategy, the walls of the Royal Street mansion began to change. They were no longer barriers, they were evidence from the outside. The Delacroix residence appeared. Dignified, tall, shuttered windows, wrought iron balconies, polished doors that suggested stability and wealth, but inside its corridors, something quieter unfolded. A careful containment disguised as protection. Charles Delacroix treated her not as servant, yet never as equal. She dined in private chambers, wore silk gowns, and was granted access to the family library, yet she was forbidden to cross the courtyard. Gate visitors were told she was kin from France, unfamiliar with English, and too delicate for society, and when questions pressed too closely, doors closed. Elellanena listened more than she spoke. In the evenings she would sit near the balcony, where the air carried fragments of conversation from passing carriages. The city hummed with opera houses and slave markets, existing within walking distance, contradictions, layered like brick and mortar, and in that city, blood determined destiny. New Orleans was not like other southern cities. It did not operate on a simple division of black and white. It functioned on gradations, categories, calculations. Free people of color owned property. Some even owned slaves. Quadrumbles negotiated relationships under chandeliers, while auction blocks operated by daylight. The law itself was a maze shaped by French, Spanish, and American codes, and somewhere within that maze lay the key to her identity. She began her journal in February of 1838, neat measured script describing whether books, the meals sent to her room, but beneath those ordinary lines anxiety gathered. He says, "My papers are being processed." He says, "It is for my protection." He says, "I must remain unseen." The repetition troubled her because promises without timelines are simply cages disguised as kindness. When Dr. Samuel Lawrence visited, he saw more than illness. He saw a woman trying to speak, and a man determined she would not, and in his medical journal, he recorded her question, "Do you know of my true circumstances before my arrival here?" Before he could answer, returned, and silence Hardened silence became her greatest adversary, but silence also sharpened her focus. In April, a visitor arrived, an elderly man introduced only as Villars. His gaze lingered not with desire but scrutiny, as though searching for a familiar angle in her cheek or the shape of her eyes. He and Delacroix spoke in French, believing she could not follow, but she had grown up with her mother's stories and she understood enough to hear the words. Resemblance and bloodline. When she confronted Delacroix later, his agitation betrayed him. He reminded her that without free papers, she remained legally his property. Regardless of history, regardless of truth, that night she did not sleep. Instead, she began assembling memory. Her mother, in Philadelphia, a gold locket engraved with the ship stories of a French merchant who died before her birth. The careful way her mother avoided certain questions, and the letters tucked inside. A Bible never meant to be surrendered. The possibility emerged slowly. Then all at once, if her father had not merely been a merchant but a member of the Villars family, if a marriage had taken place unacknowledged, if documentation existed, then her presence in New Orleans was not coincidence. It was a threat, and threats in powerful families are not released. They are contained by some. Her hope that Delacroix would secure her freedom dissolved. He had paid too much to relinquish her easily. And perhaps more dangerously, he knew enough about her origins to understand what her liberty might cost others. So she planned. The housemaid assigned to her rooms became a first fragile ally. Coins changed hands. Small conversations were layered with coded intent, and in July she wrote that she had arranged for a message to be delivered to the American consul's office. If records in Philadelphia confirmed her birth, her freedom could be undeniable. But betrayal travels faster than hope. On August 2nd, her journal recorded a single line. It was a trap. The maid informed him of my plan. I am to be moved tomorrow. The following weeks was swallowed by silence, and when she resumed writing, it was from Beau Refuge, the Delacroix sugar plantation 50 miles downriver, where humidity clung to skin and labor to find existence there. She was placed in the former overseer's house, isolated from both main residence and slave quarters, watched by a woman named Martha, who carried herself with guarded compassion. Beau Refuge was not a refinement. It was a warning. She saw Delacroix only once, when he arrived to inform her that further attempts to contact authorities would result in her reclassification as field worker. The meaning was clear. Your identity is negotiable. Your labor is not yet. Confinement on the plantation expanded her awareness. She overheard conversations about the inheritance, about verification, about documents that could alter outcomes. When her presence was detected, voices fell silent, and she began to understand that events beyond her confinement were unfolding. In October, a stranger arrived, posing as physician Joseph Miller, a northern abolitionist, moving carefully through dangerous territory. His coded letters would later reveal that he spoke briefly with her and heard her claim of free birth and disputed inheritance. He promised investigation, but his cover was soon compromised, and he fled Louisiana, leaving her once again alone with knowledge. But without rescue, winter deepened, and with it, her resolve. On February 26, 1839, Henry Villars himself came to Beau Refuge, elderly, formidable, dismissing Martha, so he could question Elellanena directly. He asked about her mother, about a gold locket engraved with a ship, and when she confirmed its existence, he reacted, not with surprise, but recognition. He asked about her father's death, and when she repeated the story of a merchant lost at sea, he made a sound between laugh and grief, and told her her mother had been prudent, perhaps too prudent. Then he left. 3 days later, he was dead. His passing ignited a legal storm. The nephew, moved swiftly to secure inheritance, and within that turbulence Elellanenna's significance sharpened. If proof of Jean-Baptiste V. marriage to her mother surfaced, then the estate would fracture under French-influenced law, and a woman with African ancestry could claim legitimacy. Such a revelation would scandalize Louisiana society. In April, Delacroix arrived at the plantation, furious, demanding to know what the old man had said. He searched her room, seized her mother's Bible, and with it her birth certificate and letters, the last tangible proof of her identity. And as he left, she understood fully he was not her savior. He was her jailer, guarding not her safety but his interests, and perhaps those of others. By June, her journal reflected clarity. I now understand why I was brought here. It was never about my value as property, but about preventing me from claiming what might rightfully be mine. Recognition transformed fear into strategy. If the law would not move for her, she would move around it. In September, she wrote that she had found a way a riverboat would dock. Martha had agreed to help in exchange for pearl earrings, the final gift from her mother. If successful, she would reach New Orleans by nightfall and search for the documents taken from her before fleeing north. The next day, plantation records noted a missing slave matching her description. A reward offered searches launched toward river routes leading to free territories, but Elellanena did not travel north. Evidence later suggested she returned to the city that had sold her the French Quarter. So all of her movements, rumors linked her briefly to Marie Laveau networks, known to shelter fugitives, and then for nearly 3 years, she vanished from record. During that silence, inheritance proceedings concluded. Louis Villars was confirmed, ere no other claimant emerged, and Charles Delacroix faced mounting financial strain, his once prosperous operations faltering under debt. Yet beneath those official outcomes, an invisible negotiation was forming, because Elellanena was no longer merely escaping. She was positioning, and somewhere between plantation shadows and drawing room whispers, the pearl once displayed as property began preparing to re-enter society, not as fugitive, but as reckoning. The night air of New Orleans clung to Elellanena Reynolds as she moved through the narrow streets of the French Quarter, her heart a metronome against the rhythm of carriage wheels and distant laughter. She had escaped Bow Refuge. But freedom was not simply a matter of distance. It was a matter of survival, of knowing when to speak and when to vent. Corner held the scent of opportunity and danger alike. Gas lamps flickered along wrought iron railings, illuminating shadows that might be friend or spy. She carried nothing of value but the pearl earrings given to her by her mother, a token that symbolized both memory and leverage. These small objects would buy her trust, where words could not. The city itself seemed complicit in her concealment. Its contradictions, her shield opera houses and slave markets, existed side by side, a cacophony of refinement and brutality that mirrored the duality within her own life. The citizens of New Orleans passed her by, unknowingly sharing the streets with a woman whose very existence threatened the security of the wealthiest families. She had returned not just to claim her papers, but to understand the labyrinth of secrets that had ensnared her father, Jean Baba Delacroix. Family, their ambitions, their alliances, their willingness to manipulate life and death for advantage, created a network that reached into every parlor and plantation house. She needed a map of these connections, but could trust no one completely. Her first stop was a small apothecary in the French Quarter, where records indicated Marie Laveau had sometimes sheltered fugitives. The proprietor recognized her immediately. Though years had passed, he had known her as a child in Philadelphia, and as a passenger aboard the Augusta ship that brought tragedy before opportunity. Her presence was not questioned for long. He led her to a private room at the back, where whispers of rebellion against old structures moved through coded gestures and brief letters. From there, she began gathering intelligence, carefully recording observations of Delacroix, allies, and Villars' associates. She discovered that some of the men who had attended her auction still held influence, while others had withdrawn their interest, but retained knowledge of her appearance, of her parentage. This knowledge was dangerous in the wrong hands, and she understood that control of information was the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. December of 1839, a northern abolitionist visited the city. Joseph Miller returned under a new identity, claiming medical interest in slave diseases. But Elellanena was no longer the fragile woman at Bow Refuge. She was deliberate in her questions, discerning in her trust. Miller confirmed her suspicions that the Delacroix family had conspired to keep her, isolated their legal manipulations and threats designed to suppress any claim she might assert against the Villars' inheritance. Their meetings were brief and in coded language, but Elellanena extracted enough detail to piece together the breadth of Delacroix's influence and intentions. She learned of the financial vulnerabilities of Charles Delacroix, the secret accounts maintained to monitor her movements, and the letters that had passed between Louis Villars and unknown intermediaries in Paris all pointed to a plan orchestrated at the highest levels to control not only her body, but her potential claim. By the spring of 1840, Elellanena had secured the means to move unseen through parts of the city that were otherwise heavily patrolled. Her understanding of the social hierarchy became as important as her physical escape routes. She knew that appearances were weapons. The wrong gesture, the wrong conversation could alert Delacroix agents. She practiced composure. She developed an elegant confidence that allowed her to be present in society, while remaining invisible and intentioned. That confidence became crucial when she sought access to her mother's papers, long confiscated and believed lost. Her investigations led her to the edge of the Delacroix, a state where servants and minor officials could be persuaded to speak for coin or promise of protection. She discovered that some of the records had been moved between safe locations within the city, their paths obscured by months of calculated activity. It was during one of these clandestine excursions that she encountered Louis Villars. He had arrived in New Orleans to manage the inheritance quietly, and had observed her movements without revealing himself. Their first conversation was measured, cautious. He knew her story and she knew the stakes. Both understood the power that lay in partnership and in silence. He did not offer freedom outright, nor did he demand obedience. He presented options that required her agency and her judgment. Together, they planned the next phase of her reclamation. In conversations held in dimly lit parlors and in safe rooms behind apothecary shops, they calculated risks, studied associates, and formulated a timeline that would allow Elellanena to obtain her mother's papers, her birth certificate, and the legal proof of her lineage. The plan was delicate. It required the timing of riverboats, the cooperation of loyal servants, and the suppression of Delacroix's awareness. Summer brought oppressive heat, and with it increased urgency. Charles Delacroix continued his financial manipulations, and rumors of Elellenena's presence in the city reached ears that might have alerted him. The network of informants and loyalists she had cultivated became indispensable, and her ability to move through society as an unremarkable young woman allowed her to observe without detection. She discovered that Delacroix had grown increasingly paranoid, every movement tracked, every servant interrogated, every visitor scrutinized. His desperation revealed cracks in his vigilance. The very arrogance that had placed her as property on the auction block now exposed vulnerabilities she could exploit. By August, she had regained access to a portion of her mother's papers through a loyal former housemaid who had remained discreetly connected to the city's network of freed women and sympathetic servants. Elellanena examined them carefully, each line confirming birth dates, parentage, and the contested relationship to Jean-Baptiste. She realized that she now possessed proof capable of undermining Delacroix's claims and legitimizing her position as a rightful heir. With evidence secured, her attention turned to the execution of the escape itself. The riverboat that would carry her toward New Orleans Central Districts was scheduled for departure under cover of night. She coordinated with Martha, who had maintained her loyalty since Beau Refuge, providing precise instructions for meeting points, timing, and contingencies for unexpected discovery. Each step was calculated to avoid capture and ensure control over her trajectory. September arrived, and the riverboat became a temporary sanctuary. Aboard the vessel, she watched the banks pass in darkness, calculating the next series of moves. Delacroix's network extended to city streets and port authorities, yet her plan relied on speed and discretion, combined with a cultivation of strategic nightfall. She returned to New Orleans quietly, moving through streets she had once feared, now aware that every step she took was part of a larger reclamation, not simply of freedom, but of identity. She visited safe houses where letters and instructions awaited her. The city itself became a tool in her strategy, the chaos of daily life masking deliberate actions. Her final visits before confronting the Delacroix estate were precise and measured. She assessed guards, studied routines, noted weaknesses. Each observation brought her closer to not only reclaiming her identity but asserting control over those who had sought to define it. Without consent, in the weeks that followed, Elellanena continued to refine her knowledge of social networks, financial flows, and legal documents. The combination of timing, alliances, and intelligence gathering positioned her to enter the Delacroix residence, not as property, but as a force capable of disrupting the carefully constructed hierarchy that had held her captive. She understood fully that confrontation with Delacroix himself could result in violence, but her plan included contingencies for persuasion, leverage, and containment should resistance emerge. She also recognized the importance of secrecy. The public revelation of her heritage at that moment would provoke scandal, but might not yield protection. Instead, she prepared for a quiet assertion of rights where influence would speak louder than words. By the end of 1840, Elellanena Reynolds had transformed from captive to strategist. Her movements, deliberate her intentions, precise her understanding of the intersection between social expectation, legal documentation, and personal leverage allowed her to operate in spaces previously denied. She was no longer the pearl displayed as ornament at auction. She was a woman who understood the economy of secrecy and the currency of information. Her journal during this period reflects a mind constantly calculating possibilities, recording observations, and noting loyalties she had cultivated. The entries capture the tension between patience and action, the recognition that the stakes were life and death, and that control over her narrative required vigilance, intelligence, and courage. The final months of planning leading into early 1841 brought the culmination of her efforts. The papers confirming her parentage were in place, the timing of travel coordinated with allies loyal to her cause, and the social appearances that would mask her presence had been rehearsed meticulously. Every element of the plan required precision and trust, both of which were scarce commodities in a city where alliances were fragile and danger pervasive. As the riverboats and carriage routes were synchronized, Elellanena reflected on the journey that had brought her from the auction block to this moment: the escape from Beau Refuge, the acquisition of documents, the cultivation of networks, the quiet observation of those who once claimed ownership of her body. All of these elements formed a web of strategy and purpose. She had learned that freedom was not simply a destination but an exercise in constant vigilance, a combination of intellect, courage, and timing that allowed her to outmaneuver those who would see her confined or erased from history. She had transformed fear into a tool, a motivator, and a signal of intent. By early spring 1841, the stage was set. Elellanena Reynolds understood the city, the families, and the stakes. She had the proof to claim her inheritance, the understanding to navigate the social and legal constraints, and the network of loyalists who would facilitate her next moves. This was not the final victory, but a decisive turning point. The balance of power had shifted subtly, but irrevocably. She was no longer an object to be bought or hidden. She was a participant in a larger game, a woman who had reclaimed the agency that society had denied her since the moment she was placed on the auction block. And as she prepared to re-enter the Delacroix mansion with new purpose and evidence in hand, Elellanena Reynolds understood that her struggle was no longer only for survival. It was for identity, recognition, and justice. In a world designed to obscure both, she had become a shadow, moving among the powerful yet orchestrating outcomes with precision, patience, and the relentless pursuit of autonomy. Her journal closes in 1841 with a sense of anticipation, a recognition that the next months would determine the terms of her liberation and the security of those she intended to protect. Her journey from Beau Refuge to the streets of New Orleans had been one of endurance, strategy, and courage. She was ready to act, and history would soon record her presence, not as Pearl, the object of auction, but as Elellanena Reynolds, a force in her own right. Asterisk. The winter of 1841 descended on New Orleans with a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the French Quarter. But Elellanena Reynolds felt a fire within that no cold could extinguish. The city had become both her maze and her ally. She moved with careful purpose along the cobblestone streets, the muffled sounds of carriages and distant laughter masking her deliberate footsteps. She had learned that the world outside Beau Refuge demanded a combination of courage and cunning that few possessed. Months had passed since her escape from the plantation, but freedom had not yet become safety. Every ally she had cultivated, Martha, the loyal servant, the apothecary who had once sheltered fugitives. Even a few cautious merchants had been tested for trustworthiness and loyalty. Her every step was measured and her movements choreographed to avoid detection by Delacroix's ever-watchful network. The auction block, though distant, still haunted her mind, not as a memory of submission but as a catalyst for strategy. Her immediate goal was simple yet perilous: recover her mother's papers, the legal proof of her birth and lineage that would establish her as the legitimate heir to the Villiers fortune. These documents had been hidden for decades, shuffled between Delacroix estates and trusted confidants, with enough secrecy to frustrate even the most determined investigator. Elellanena understood that acts required not forced but subtlety, persuasion, and the ability to navigate society is both invisible and present. She began by mapping the network of Delacroix allies. She observed the houses along Royal Street and the neighboring districts, noting windows, guards, servants, and patterns of movement. Her knowledge of social customs became a weapon. She could attend salons, masquerade balls, and public gatherings without drawing suspicion, all while noting alliances and vulnerabilities. She discovered that Charles Delacroix's financial affairs were precarious, that he relied heavily on intermediaries, and that his paranoia about her movements often led to lapses in vigilance. Through clandestine meetings with loyal former servants, she learned of hidden safes and locked cabinets where documents had been placed for temporary security. Each fragment of information was carefully recorded in her journal, coded in ways that only she could decipher. The risk was immense. One slip could lead to recapture or worse, and Elellanena felt the weight of both her own life and the potential consequences for those who aided her. In early March, she managed to secure a meeting with Joseph Miller, the Northern abolitionist who had once infiltrated Louisiana society. He arrived under the guise of medical research on slave conditions, but she knew his true purpose was to act as a discreet conduit of information. He confirmed suspicions she had long held. The Delacroix family had been monitoring her since the auction and had relied on intimidation, blackmail, and misinformation to suppress any claims she might assert. The legal system offered no recourse. The only path forward lay in her own hands. Her alliance with Louis Villars had solidified by this time. Though their first interactions had been cautious, they shared mutual respect and understanding. He recognized the power of her intellect and strategic vision, and she understood that his resources and status could be leveraged to secure both her freedom and protection. They devised plans in secrecy, selecting locations known to be unobserved, and methods that exploited the overconfidence of Delacroix's agents. By late spring, Elellanena had gathered enough intelligence to take bold action. She infiltrated the Delacroix townhouse at night, using knowledge of servant routines and security gaps. Her movements were silent, deliberate, and confident. Each corridor navigated was a demonstration of her mastery over space. Previously dominated by fear, she retrieved several documents hidden in old boxes and cabinets, confirming her mother's birth certificate and other papers, establishing her claim to the Villars lineage. The act itself was a combination of courage, precision, and patience. The discovery of these documents marked a turning point. She now possessed not only proof of her parentage, but leverage over Delacroix. The letters, certificates, and family records painted a picture of entitlement and legitimacy that Delacroix could not publicly dispute. Yet even with this advantage, Elellanena knew that discretion was crucial. Any overt action risked retaliation and possibly the lives of those who had aided her. She spent the following months consolidating her knowledge of the Delacroix estate, observing patterns, intercepting communications, and coordinating with trusted allies in the city. Her understanding of human behavior became as critical as any legal argument. She studied Delacroix's reliance on intermediaries, his financial vulnerabilities, and his obsession with social appearance, all elements that could be used to manipulate outcomes in her favor. The autumn of 1841 brought both opportunity and tension. The city's social calendar provided occasions to move unnoticed among the elite. She attended events where whispers of the Pearl's beauty still lingered, yet no one recognized her as the same woman once displayed at auction. She observed Delacroix associates, noted their movements, and quietly ensured that her presence was invisible to those who might report back to her former captors. In October, she received word from Martha that a secure location had been prepared to store her documents and other evidence. She coordinated transportation through the city under cover of night. Using trusted riverboats and alleys, her network had expanded to include sympathetic merchants and former servants willing to risk exposure for a just cause. Each move was calculated with contingencies for interception and concealment. By November, Elellanena had established a temporary base in New Orleans. Quieter districts here. She could plan without immediate threat yet remain close enough to observe Deloque and his associates. The city's geography had become a tool. She knew the streets, the alleys, the waterways, and used them to move freely while remaining invisible. She had transformed from prey into strategist, active agent. Her journal from this period reflects meticulous planning, observation, and moral deliberation. She recorded the names, roles, and behaviors of those she encountered, noting potential allies and threats. Her entries reveal a mind constantly balancing risk and opportunity, aware that each decision could have life or death consequences. The words capture both fear and resolve, the tension of a life lived on the edge of freedom as winter deepened. Elellanena prepared for the next stage, confronting Deloque indirectly and securing her freedom through leverage and timing. She recognized that direct confrontation could provoke violence and possibly compromise her claim. She planned to assert control over the situation without revealing the full extent of her knowledge until the moment it would be most effective. She arranged meetings with trusted intermediaries who could convey her terms, negotiate settlements, and ensure that Deloque's actions would be constrained. She understood that influence and perception were as powerful as any legal instrument, and that the careful orchestration of appearances could achieve results that brute force could not. By December, she had positioned herself at the center of a web of information and alliances. Her careful observation, strategic planning, and meticulous preparation had shifted the balance of power. She was no longer at the mercy of Deloque or the legacy of her auction. She had the documents, the knowledge, and the network to claim both her freedom and her rightful place in the Villiers inheritance. The final weeks of 1841 were spent rehearsing movements, verifying alliances, and ensuring contingencies were in place. Her journal notes reveal a blend of anticipation, anxiety, and resolve. She was aware that the coming months would determine not only her liberty but the security of those she sought to protect, and the enforcement of justice against those who had once sought to suppress her. And as the year ended, Reynolds stood poised on the brink of reclaiming her narrative. She had transformed from the pearl of legend into a woman of intellect and agency, navigating a treacherous social landscape with precision, patience, and unyielding determination. She understood that the culmination of her planning, observation, and alliances would soon bring resolution to the chapter begun at the auction block in 1837. She was ready to act. The stage was set, and history awaited her next move. The night of February 12, 1842 arrived over New Orleans, cloaking the city in fog and shadow. Elellanena Reynolds moved through the streets with calm purpose. Every step measured, every breath controlled. She had waited for this moment for months, the culmination of careful planning, observation, and patience. The MardisGrasMystery at the St. Louis Hotel provided the perfect cover. The opulent celebration meant that the city's attention was elsewhere. Yet she knew that Charles Deloque's eyes would be searching. Even here she wore a gown of midnight blue silk, the color chosen not for vanity, but for its subtle command of presence. She moved with elegance and confidence, as whispers of the pearl's beauty followed her like a faint echo of memory. Louis Villars met her at the carriage outside his residence, their nods, silent communication, a pact of understanding and shared purpose. The streets were slick with rain, the gas lamps casting trembling reflections on the cobblestones. Their journey to the hotel was deliberate, avoiding obvious routes, taking advantage of alleys and quiet thoroughfares that allowed them to arrive without notice. The ballroom awaited, yet the true work was elsewhere, hidden behind walls and in shadows and documents and secrets that had been denied to her for far too long. Inside the hotel, the music swelled and laughter echoed. Elellanenna's eyes scanned the crowd, noting familiar faces, those who had once bid for her as property, and those who remained instruments of Deloque's influence. She did not feel fear, only determination. Her presence commanded attention, not through the spectacle of beauty alone, but through the quiet aura of someone who had endured and mastered the forces arrayed against her. She moved with measured grace to the entrance of the hall, and as she entered, the whispers died, replaced by a tense curiosity. Meanwhile, Duh watched from a distance, his expression taut, his mind racing. He had believed that her disappearance from Bow Refuge would leave him unchallenged. Yet, here she was a living reminder of his failures, a woman whose very existence undermined his claims to control. He attempted to approach, but his friends restrained him, the memory of previous confrontations with her and the presence of Louisville, acting as both protector and observer, kept him at bay for the first time in years. He faced the possibility that his wealth and influence might not secure his will. The ball continued around them, yet for Elellanena and Louis, each movement was precise. Each interaction a part of the larger orchestration. She had confirmed the location of hidden documents at the Delacroix residence earlier, through coded messages and trusted intermediaries. Tonight would determine the success of retrieving them. Her mind was focused on timing the entry so that all necessary precautions were taken, minimizing risk and ensuring that the Delacroix family would have no opportunity to react prematurely. As midnight approached, she excused herself from the ballroom, slipping through side corridors familiar from careful observation and reconnaissance in previous weeks. The air outside the main hall was cooler, quieter, and here she moved unseen, using knowledge of servant routines to access a rear entry. She found the locks more complex than expected, yet she was prepared. Tools and techniques acquired over months of planning allowed her to bypass them silently. The documents she sought lay in a cabinet previously used for family correspondence. The combination of secrecy and concealment had worked in her favor. She retrieved the papers, quickly, methodically verifying their authenticity. Each certificate, letter, and record confirmed her parentage and legitimate claim to the Vilar inheritance. Her pulse quickened not from fear but from triumph, a validation of years of strategic planning and risk-taking. The knowledge that she now possessed undeniable proof shifted the balance irrevocably. She had transformed from fugitive to holder of leverage, from victim to active agent of her destiny. Louis Villars joined her shortly thereafter, his presence reassuring, yet equally vigilant. Together they ensured that the documents were secured for transport. Their movements were deliberate, careful, leaving no trace of entry or disturbance beyond physical evidence. The psychological advantage was theirs. Delacroix could not act openly without risking exposure and legal consequences that now favored Elellanena. The return to the ballroom was seamless. They appeared as any other guests, a display of elegance and composure concealing the decisive actions. Just completed. The crowd continued to celebrate, oblivious to the subtle shift in power that had occurred within their midst. Whispers of the Pearl's return mingled with curiosity, yet none could perceive the full scope of the quiet revolution unfolding in the hands of a woman who had once been auctioned as property. In the following days, Elellanena coordinated the safe relocation of the documents and arranged for trusted allies to transport them securely out of New Orleans. She planned for the eventual journey to Europe, ensuring that Louis Villars' resources and influence were utilized to protect both their freedom and future. The meticulous preparation extended to contingencies, anticipating potential interference by Delacroix or his associates. Every possible scenario accounted for. By mid-February, the final arrangements were in place, and Elellanena prepared to leave New Orleans legally free, with incontrovertible proof of her identity and a financial settlement negotiated discreetly with Louisville. The city that had once confined her now provided the path to liberation. The streets and riverways she had studied and navigated for years, becoming instruments of escape rather than imprisonment. Her understanding of the social hierarchy, the power of secrecy, and the leverage of documentation had converged to create a window of opportunity. On February 12th, they departed the city, boarding a steamship bound for France, a calculated move that removed them from the immediate reach of those who had sought to suppress her existence. Their departure was unremarkable to casual observers, yet monumental in consequence. It represented the culmination of years of careful planning, courage, and strategic insight. Every element of the journey had been considered, from timing to disguises to the management of witnesses and documentation. Meanwhile, the Delacroix residence became the scene of swift retribution and concealment. The precise events of the following days suggest that Charles and Isabel Delacroix were eliminated in a controlled operation designed to remove threats to Elellanenna's freedom and the secured inheritance. The execution of their secretary and plantation manager indicates careful orchestration and planning, a response that ensured no obstacles remained to threaten the future she had carved through intellect, courage, and unyielding will. The careful separation and protection of the Delacroix children demonstrate the moral complexity of Elellanenna's actions, even within the context of necessity. She influenced arrangements, ensuring that those most vulnerable were shielded from harm while neutralizing those who posed existential threats. Her actions were decisive yet tempered with consideration for lives not yet culpable in past injustices. Orchestration of protection and elimination reveals a depth of foresight and ethical negotiation rarely recorded in historical accounts. Upon arrival in Europe, Elellanena and Louis established a secure household, asserting control over their identities and fortune while shielding themselves from potential interference. The documents confirming her parentage allowed her to live not as ward or property but as rightful heir and partner. She assumed a new name in accordance with social customs, yet retained the essence of her identity, the culmination of a struggle not only for freedom but for recognition of her humanity. Over the ensuing years, Elellanena documented her experiences and maintained correspondence with loyal allies, ensuring the preservation of knowledge and strategic alliances. She raised her children in safety, affording them opportunities denied to her by the circumstances of her birth, yet she never abandoned the lessons of vigilance, prudence, and moral calculation that had defined her rise from captivity to sovereignty. The Delacroix mansion remained abandoned for decades, acquiring a reputation for haunting. Yet the real legacy was the invisible transformation of power and status that Elellanena had achieved. She had subverted a system built on exploitation using intellect, courage, and foresight as tools of liberation. She became both symbol and agent of justice, navigating a landscape where legal recourse was insufficient and social norms threatened to constrain agency. Ultimately, Elellanena Reynolds' story concludes not merely with escape but with strategic mastery over circumstances intended to define and confine her. She claimed her heritage, secured freedom, and enacted a complex resolution to the threats she faced. Her life exemplifies resilience, intelligence, and the capacity to transform trauma into agency, a narrative that transcends simple categorization and resonates as an enduring testament to human will and ingenuity. Even as she lived out her remaining years in Europe, raising a family and integrating into society, she maintained vigilance over her legacy, understanding that freedom without recognition could be ephemeral. Her actions ensured that her story could not be erased, that her identity could not be suppressed, and that her lineage, previously denied, was now acknowledged in this final act of courage and calculated action. Elellanena demonstrated that power is as much a product of intellect, preparation, and patience as it is of wealth or force. The legacy she created, the documentation she recovered, and the life she secured became enduring testaments to her resolve and skill. She left New Orleans physically, but her influence remained embedded in the city's history and its whispered tales and preserved artifacts, illustrating the triumph of human agency over systemic oppression. The story of the Pearl ends with the reclamation of freedom, identity, and inheritance, with the orchestration of justice and survival in a world that sought to deny her every right. It is a narrative of courage, strategy, and the unyielding human spirit, one that continues to echo through history and into the hearts of those who study her journey.